afternoon, everybody. We can't have a healthy planet without a healthy ocean, okay? And I'm prepared to argue that with you all day, if you like, but I'm sure you all agree with me. But the bad news is that the ocean's health is currently measurably in decline. And again, I could go through all those measurements with you, but that's not what we're here for. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we do have a plan, and when I say we, I mean humanity, has a plan for our survival on the planet. And I'll get to why we need that plan. But the plan is basically the Paris Climate Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them. That's our plan. We don't really have anything else bigger than that to save things for our grandchildren on this planet. And why do we need such a survival plan? Because currently, we're on a path towards a 3-degree world, 3 degree in the sense of global warming since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And 3 degrees is, as the Secretary General of the United Nations has said, an unlivable world. So my little granddaughter, who I'm going to pick up from kindy in about half an hour, is being consigned, along with your young ones, to an unlivable world. And the consignment is courtesy of our addiction to the products of the oil and gas industry. And most of us in the room have got some association with that, even if it's just driving a car. So this is important stuff, obviously, because we're not going to allow our grandchildren to be consigned to an unlivable world. And that's where the ocean comes in, because the ocean is such an important part of it. Those Sustainable Development Goals that I mentioned, SDG 14 is the ocean goal, which is to conserve and sustainably use the resources of the ocean. And that's basically what I do. I go around the world advocating for and making sure we're being honest in our implementation of that goal. And anyway, I'm not going to talk to you for too long because we've got a really articulate young person rather than inarticulate old person to actually explain all this stuff here. I'm going to ask her the questions and she's going to give the answers. And I've just been talking to her backstage and she's really a wonderful advocate. Because her great interest is in 30 by 30, which means protecting 30% of the planet by 2030, 7 years' time. That was agreed to by all of us, by all countries at the Kunming, Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework Agreement that took place about 18 months ago. So without more ado from me, I want to introduce somebody to you, and I'm going to read this because it's so impressive. She is a Youth Leader Award winner obviously from Indonesia, as you're going to hear, and she's founder of an organization called 30 by 30. But she is already, at the age of 20, a National Geographic Young Explorer. She's a winner of the Ocean Awards Young Initiative by Blue Marine Foundation and Boat International. I know both of them from the UK. And she's been named EE30 Under 30 by the North American Association for Environmental Education. That's an incredible list, along with the fact she's your Global Citizen Youth Leader Award. She's won that as well. So amazing to do all that by 20. So welcome on the stage, Brigitta Gunawan. Where is she? Okay, Brigitta, they're giving me a whole bunch of questions to ask you here, but why don't we start with that 30 by 31? As we were talking about backstage, personally, I think that 30 by 30 initiative is probably almost the holy grail, but how we're going to get there by 2030 is a matter of fast-tracking big time. But tell me, what are your views on 30 by 30?
Yeah, so 30 by 30 for me personally is a very important goal, not only because it's a global, international regulation. It's something that's really important on a national and global scale, but it is also something that local communities can benefit from if we act responsibly and sustainably manage them in a way that benefits and lets communities coexist.
Okay. You know, when I think about 30 by 30, you know, and put it in the context of the ocean and how we're going to protect 30% of the ocean, I guess you've got to look at the ocean from the point of view of exclusive economic zones, and then you've got the high seas, right? And I think the regional viewpoint is going to be really important there, because who better to decide whether 30% should be in the high seas than the regions in which they're based. So coming from Indonesia and ASEAN, you're lucky there, you've got a strong regional organization. Do you see a lot of potential for by 30 by 30 in the waters, both inside the EEZs of the ASEAN countries, but also outside in the adjoining high seas?
Yeah, I see a lot of potential, especially as the world's largest archipelago. We have so many people who are in this space and who will reap the benefits of implementing 30 by 30, both within the national boundaries and beyond, right? And I think it's really critical for us to make sure that we're good listeners to the communities on the ground who are on the front lines, who are most impacted by these issues. And we shouldn't be going in and saying, this is what the law is going to be, and disregarding what they are facing on the ground. But we need to listen to them and approach it in a way that makes sure they understand, because conservation in itself is not only about marine life, it's not only about ecosystems, but it's also about the human livelihoods that depend on that. The people who are subsistence fishing, there's a fine line between subsistence and commercial fishing, for example, right?
Yeah.
Who are the people who are actually benefiting most
Yeah.
from these regulations?
Yeah.
Is it the people who fish for a living, or is it the commercial fishers who are driven by global markets?
Yeah. No, I like that point, and I'm going to come back to that. But can I ask you, first of all, specifically, what are your strategies and targets? I mean, what's 30 by 30 Indonesia got in mind?
Yeah, so 30 by 30 Indonesia was started as a campaign. I launched it when I was 17 as part of a fellowship with Earth Echo International. And essentially, we use education to bridge the gap between landlocked and coastal communities through immersive learning experiences, where we bring students into science-based programs like mangrove planting, but we learn from experts, and we provide experiences like coral reef restoration. For example, we have our own 30 by 30 coral garden. It's an artificial reef on the northeast coast of Bali. And what we are aiming to do is to strengthen the connections and the community work that we have there, to make sure that they play a part, especially the youth, play a part in building a resilience to and adapting to climate change, right? So it's all about strengthening these local communities and advocating for the global goal in a way that is more approachable, more accessible, and breaking down the points of what a global goal might look like on a local perspective.
Excellent. And so education. Getting into, at what level do you get into education? You're going to schools, or do you do this on television? How do you do that in Indonesia?
Yeah, so when I first started, I was working among schools. So we started off in schools around Jakarta, and we went to Bali as well, because we have a lot of partners there. So we started among schools as clubs and some digital activations as well. So we garnered about 400 people's pictures saying, let's support 30 by 30 back during the pandemic when no on-the-ground activities was accessible. So we managed to do that and unite these young people who are also passionate, who turned out caring for our ocean. And later on, we realized that the G20, they declared, they put 30 by 30 as part of their leaders' declaration when it was held in Bali. And I'd like to think that at least I've played a very small part of trying to advocate for 30 by 30 in my community and the communities that I work with. And we approach this in a way that makes sure that we provide free opportunities for young people, particularly because we know that the ocean space, there are a lot of barriers, right? You may not be able to access the ocean if not for example, your geographical location, financial barriers, and a lot of the list goes on.
Yeah.
And we are trying to transcend barriers and make the ocean spaces more accessible and inclusive. We want to make sure that we provide an open source asset and provide learning opportunities that allow them to experience eureka moments like I did when I first experienced my first marine protected area.
Right. Oh, that's fascinating. I'm really glad to hear that you were part of that movement in Bali, because I do recall that 30 by 30 kind of got underway. The G20 everybody knows about, but they probably don't know about O20, which was something we launched in Bali. It was actually the Minister of Seas and myself and the President of the World Economic Forum who launched that, so thanks for the impetus that you gave us. But that's now been carried on by the last G20 president was India last year, and Brazil is this year. And both the Indians and the Brazilians are upping the ante on O20 all the time. So it's a lot more than just 30 by 30 now. So well done on that, and thank you. Look, I want to come back to that opening comment that you made about people versus conservation, because there is a fine balance there. And of course, that's what SDG 14 is about, with protect, conserve, but also sustainable use of. So you've got to think about the welfare of coastal communities, and in fact, the welfare of everybody when you look at SDG 14. So tell us some of your thoughts about how you do balance, at a more local level. I mean, you come from the world's largest archipelago. You've got more coastal communities probably than anybody else. What are your views on that?
Yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge that it's not just about conservation when we're talking about 30 by 30 or SDG 14. It's more about how we can take a holistic approach, because all these issues are interconnected, right? We can't step towards a more sustainable and equitable future for our planet, for our ocean, without addressing socioeconomic issues. We need to make sure we tackle it step by step, but also make sure we work together intergenerationally, co-create, and make sure that we are good listeners to people who are most impacted by climate change, and make sure that we understand that we must acknowledge our past mistakes and the luxury of choice. For example, for people to choose whether or not to use plastic, it's not always a choice that everybody has. What if it's all about, goes down to what they can afford, right?
Yeah.
And people in positions of power should be leading, spearheading collaborative approaches to these issues.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. Backstage, you mentioned to me that you were interested in the disproportionate aspects of climate change. It's well accepted now that the people who are suffering the most from climate change are not actually the ones that caused it. And there's no better example than small and developing states with massive EEZs. Think of places like Kiribati, for example, which are, in Kiribati's case, I think still a least developing country, and yet they're expected to protect 30% of their EEZ. And that story goes all the way through developing country, coastal states, and small and developing states. How are they expected to meet the costs of not only establishment, but governance of marine protected areas? Surely this is something that should be a global burden, especially by those that caused the problem in the first place, rather than something that's put upon them just because they happen to own most of the ocean.
Yeah, I think it's also important to consider and realize that we have one global ocean, right? It's the responsibility of everyone. We should stray away from using the plural for oceans, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we recognize it's a global responsibility, but also if you are in a position of power, if you are, for example, countries that have more power, that are more developed, that have more resources, they should be helping, they should be responsible for the due diligence of trying to make the world a better place, make the ocean a better place.
Yeah, and the maintenance thereof, right? So that's why I guess what ODA is all about. But it's more than ODA. That can't solve everything. It's about civil society and private sector getting involved as well. But most capital is in the developed world, so that's where we've got to see the transfer occurring. Thanks for mentioning that point about the singular ocean, because I was in Nairobi last week at the UN Environment Assembly, and they tried to get a resolution through to say that there's only one ocean, because you've still got 50% of the world talking about oceans in plural. And I would say the intelligent viewpoint now, of course, is just one ocean. Why is it important not to use the plural, as Brigitta has just said? Because it's one bathtub, right? And you turn on the tap at one end, let's say the Greenland ice sheet melting, going into that bathtub. Well, what's going to happen? Levels are going to go up, and places like Tuvalu are going to go underwater because of that tap being turned on. Now, if it was all these different oceans, many oceans, Tuvalu wouldn't be suffering from what's happening in Greenland. But that's not the case, unfortunately. It's one ocean. And of course, the same goes for all the thermohaline currents of the world and so on. It's all a global system rather than a system pertaining to different oceans. And of course, you look at things like biodiversity and fish migration and so on. So it's one ocean. It's very important for, in fact, it's the first principle of ocean literacy, is that there's one ocean with many features. So good point. Any other points that you would like to enlighten us on?
What about the High Seas Treaty?
High Seas Treaty, otherwise known as BBNJ, UN speak for biological biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions. They do love that stuff at the UN. 20 years to get to this High Seas Treaty, which is kind of just this logical thing of providing for governance of the high seas. That's everything beyond the EEZs, again, EEZs, exclusive economic zones of countries under the law of the sea. It's been agreed to, but it hasn't been ratified. I think it's 60 countries have got to ratify. Is it 60? Yeah, to get there. And we're getting there close. That'll be ratified by the time of the UN Ocean Conference. I'm pretty confident about that, which is in June next year. But then ratification is fine. It comes into force, but then implementation, How are we going to get that 30 by 30 done by 2030? That's the big challenge for me. And we have to get that 30 by 30 done, because without it, we have this vast swathe of biodiversity being lost to us. That's what science tells us. So are you doing the interview or am I doing the interview? I think you
Can do both ways.
ask me another question. So I'm a bit passionate about that one. I did leave that challenge in Nairobi last week, which is 30 by 30. Yeah, that is the Holy Grail. We need it. We have to have it. But 7 years, we can't wait around for the High Seas Treaty to come into force and have all its COPs and all the rest. We have to start work now on identifying where that 30% is. A climate-smart choice of 30% of the ocean where biodiversity can survive at the levels which we need. That's our challenge, to fast-track that. We need to be working on that now so that when the High Seas Treaty is in force, we can then implement it. That is the way I see it anyway.
Yeah, and just to quickly add on, I can't believe that it took basically over 20 years, that's as old as I am, to simply adopt the High Seas Treaty, and it was just last year. And to realize that the ocean is often overlooked, despite its importance as a climate regulator,
Yep.
And a connection for many communities worldwide, whether you're near or far from the ocean.
Yeah. Yes, and unfortunately, that I would say lack of responsibility by my generation and the generation between you and me. I would say lack of responsibility. And there's a good example just came up last week at the WTO ministerial meeting in Abu Dhabi, where once again ministers failed to agree to ban harmful fisheries subsidies, which lead to overcapacity of global fishing fleets. The human absurdity of subsidizing public money is going to create overcapacity of fishing fleets, which then are going out to catch diminishing stocks of fish. You know, we overfish by 34%, have been doing for a decade now, as an FAO stat. So we give money to the fishing fleets to subsidize them so they can go out and catch those diminishing stocks. That's the absurdity of it. But anyway, the ministers did not manage to, let's be honest, because of one country, India, objecting at this stage. So we've got to work on how to better deliver on what is required. The other big one would be the plastic treaty, or the plastics treaty as they call it, which is to try and stop marine plastic pollution, which you all know is just poison. There's going to be more plastic than fish in the world by 2050 if we carry on the way we're going. So that treaty, which is under negotiation now, having a robust treaty is just so important. And that's governments. You know, you've got to go on your governments, because it's not you and I that can change that. It's the governments when they get together. And that's where the people here can influence their government. I come from Fiji, by the way. I'm not being Australian here. Yeah, other important points to you. What you going to do when you get back to Indonesia about plastic pollution? That's such a major one in your country.
It is. It's an ongoing issue, both for Indonesia and for many Southeast Asian countries. But I think it's all about addressing systemic change. We can't approach it only from an environmental lens. We need to see the root cause of the issue and reframe the problem and better understand what the root cause is to address it holistically.
And I saw up on the screen somebody talking before afternoon tea where he was talking about the role of consumers, you know, individuals. How important is that in a developing country like Indonesia? I think it's very achievable in a developed country, and I try to practice it when you go to the supermarket, you know, try and buy the brands that are circular products. But in a developing country, is that harder to do?
I think, for me personally, I think it is a little bit of a struggle, because when you're dealing with communities or people who are trying to put food on the table, the first thing you're thinking of is just that basic need, right? You're not thinking about sustainability, but you're thinking about price. But how do we change that mindset? How do we make sure that we think about these people who don't have the luxury of choice, like I mentioned earlier? How do we create circumstances in which people who are most vulnerable in these communities to have a choice to be more sustainable, have a choice to not over-extract our ocean, to not pollute? How do we make those circumstances available to them?
Well, that's a question, so I'm going to give an answer. I think that the corporations that produce these products, that, you know, and I know in Indonesia's case, sachets are one of your biggest marine polluters, the plastic sachets, that I think extended producer responsibility and the responsibility of the corporations, because if you look at it worldwide, it's these giant corporations which are actually packaging food in particular in plastic that need to change what they are giving us for our choices, right? Which is, in most cases now, a single-use plastic. Packaging their products. That's got to change. There are nature-based alternatives. There are many better alternatives than just throw away one single-use plastic. Well, look, anybody would like to ask Brigitta a question? You've got a young world expert here. Just stand up and grab it. I don't know how much time we got, but we're ready to talk all afternoon. No questions? I think we've pretty much done it. But folks, I'll end on the same way that I started, and then I'll give Brigitta a chance to say her last word. But I go back to that fact, and this is a fact, that we can't have a healthy planet without a healthy ocean, and that the ocean is currently measurably in decline. Its health is measurably in decline. So, you know, our task is to stop that happening. Here in Australia, you've got major things to do in fishing. You've got major things to do in terms of coral protection. You've got major things to do in terms of global warming. And of course, it's global warming, which is causing the heating up of the ocean, the swathe of marine, the hottest year on record in the ocean, which is killing coral and raising sea levels and all the other things. So, you know, the big challenge is, what's your country going to do about it? I put that challenge to every country I go to. So I've left it with you. Brigitta, what's your final word?
Well, I guess because we're here with Global Citizen and as Global Citizen, I do want to emphasize the fact that we do have the power to take action. It's all about the intention, and taking the first step might be difficult, for example, changing your daily habits, but you need to take that first step. You don't need to aim for perfection, but you do need to take that challenge of, for example, using reusable bottles or making more conscious decisions, and you need to start now.
Great. So the circular economy, the sustainable blue economy, and forget about that throwaway linear single-use thing that we were sold a pup on back in the 1950s. Okay, thanks very much for your help, and a big hand for Brigitta.